Hello and welcome everyone. In this video I'm going to be going over some more categories in the Brush Studio. This is part 2 of a part 3 series that I'm doing about the Brush Studio. So part 1 I went over the first 5 attributes or categories in the Brush Studio. So if you haven't seen that video, you're going to want to watch that one first, if possible. And as I said, there will be one more coming out after this, part 3. And then after that, there'll be a few brush types that we make together that I show you how to change the different specifications on this menu to create a specific type of brush. So I'm going to do that a couple times. There'll be a few examples of that after these parts are done. And then all of these are all part of my Procreate for Beginners series. So this is kind of a sub-series in the big series. And I have a bunch more videos about, pretty much everything having to do with Procreate. The only thing I'm not talking about is the 3D stuff because I'm not really into that myself. But if you haven't seen any of those videos, you'll want to check those out as well if you want to learn about Procreate. And eventually, when I'm done teaching through all these topics individually, I'm going to start doing projects that take some of the things together in a practical way. So those will be coming up soon. Depending on when you're watching this, they may already be available. Everything will be in my Procreate and digital art playlist, so you'll want to save that. But anyway, let's get on with part 2 of the Brush Studio. Alright, so as I said, this is part 2. I am picking for this video, I am picking more of a painting in the painting category. We'll probably go through a few of these brushes. I'm just going to pick for the flat brush for right now. And in part 1, we went over these 5 categories here: stroke, path, stabilization, taper, shape, and grain. So again, if you don't know what any of those do, you should go back to part 1 and watch that first. But we're going to go do rendering, wet mix, and color dynamics in this video. And then the rest of them will be in part 3. So these have all more to do with color and using something more like a paintbrush rather than like a marker or a pen as your brush on Procreate. So we're going to talk about those together. They all kind of go together a little bit more. So that's going to be, this is also a little bit more complicated than the rest of it. Like, this is the hardest one. So if you don't understand any of this right away and it seems way above your head, don't worry about it. It will get easier. The more practice you have, you may have to watch this a few times to kind of understand or find another video that maybe explains it too. But I'm going to do my best here. So yeah, let's get started on that. So going to rendering. First you have these 6 things here. I'm just going to toggle through them real quick to kind of show you. But something I also want to do before, I want to get some color on here, so I'm going to clear this. So I'm doing this because I have to show you a couple different things with colors and how they interact with each other. So if you go through these, I'm just going to toggle through them real quick, these 6 things. I'll tell you more about what they are. But light glaze is like as if you were painting with something diluted, like maybe watercolors, something like that, where it's a little more transparent. And if you have in your shape that you use, this one's not exactly what I'm talking about, but if you have any opacity in your shape, like the opacity comes from other places, but if you have any opacity in your shape, you're going to want to, and you want it to show through, you're going to want to probably use light glaze. But it is, because like it shows the opacity more. It's more of a, like it's diluted, like watercolor. And then these basically kind of go increasing, and then intense is basically like drawing with thick like paint that's like very opaque and very thick. So like basically that kind of goes in order. There's glaze and then there's blending, but the difference between the top and the bottom is like this one is more diluted and like watercolor and shows more of the opacity, and then this doesn't show very much opacity, if at all, a little bit there, and it's like thick paint going on the canvas. So you can kind of go through and see the difference, and it depends on the brush you're using again and the colors you're using. But these are all, rendering mode is like how they're going to show up on your canvas. So again, this is more opaque, more transparent. Like I keep saying, like watercolors. And then, they're all going to be a little different from each other, but they get thicker and thicker as you go down, basically. And in fact, this uniformed glaze is what is used in Adobe Photoshop, like the same kind of rendering they use. And then intense is like a slightly heavier version of those two. And then heavy is like the strongest. But it's a glaze, so it still has that opacity. And then uniform blending is sort of like uniform glaze. It uses that same rendering as Photoshop, but it gives more of a wet look to the paint. And then intense blending. And also, the blending part is how you're blending paint strokes together, whether that's blue on top of blue or blue on yellow or yellow on red or blue on red or whatever in this case. But these all have to do with both how it shows up on the canvas and how they show up on top of each other. We're going to kind of go over, that's more like these things, but they kind of, how they blend each stroke together, or each color if you're using different colors. So that's what the blending means. So intense is going to be a little bit more intense. And like the strokes kind of get very squashed together, like overlap each other. And a lot of these will go with the next category we're talking about, with the wet mix. So kind of depends on what you pick here, what's going to affect there. So this is actually one that they recommend using if you're going to be doing more of that wet stuff. So just so you know that. Now, showing you flow. So flow is like how much of that paint is going to actually show up on the canvas. So that's what that affects. Wet edges is it deals with the edges of your strokes, and it's gonna like soften them a little more as you move this up. And this all depends also on the blend mode you have up here, the glaze, the rendering mode, too. So if I'll show you light mode. And this is affecting not only edges, but also a little bit the opacity between the strokes. You can see that blue is getting more transparent there. Oops. But it's softening the edges of the stroke, basically. And then the burnt edges is going to kind of show as those strokes cross each other. It's going to have different effects on the stroke underneath, like the way it shows up underneath, and that's going to change within all these as well. But going back to light, so with the burnt edges, you take the burnt edges mode here, and this is like the blend modes of the layers again, and this is going to like effects again, where the strokes cross each other. Like you can really see up here where that blue and the red overlap, the differences between the edges of the strokes there, and also not only these edges but also like the edges here, like right here you can see it's kind of dark. There's a very defined edge there, whereas if you would bring it up to some of these lighter ones, like it's not as, like there isn't really a defined edge. But if you put it back on subtract, like it's got almost like a black edge to it, like where it's kind of like it's outlined a little bit in black, like on the edges. But anyway, these are all things that you can kind of play around with to get the look you want. And again, this is about how they kind of overlap each other, and whether that's like a blue overlapping a blue again, or like a blue overlapping a yellow or a red or other colors. And then the blend mode here, so you see there's burnt edges mode that's there. Blend mode is also like you're blending each stroke on top of each other rather than just the edges. So again, similarly, a lot of these are similar to the layer blend modes. So they're going to do the same kind of thing, but this is stroke by stroke and not layer over layer, if that makes sense. And then the luminance blending is where it takes like the brightness of those colors rather than the color, like the hue. And it's blending those with this blend mode rather than the color. It's the brightness value more. So again, these are all kind of things you have to, depending on what you're trying to do with your brush. And these are more for like painting color brushes rather than, you know, just trying to draw something on the screen, like a pen or a marker. Although some markers have this as well. But that is that, where is normal? There it is. So that is what those all are. I'm going to clear the drawing pad for right now, and we're going to go into wet mix. All right, so for wet mix, I'm actually going to pick a different brush. So I'm going to done out of here. I'm going to go down to the water category because these are more wet. I'll pick the wet sponge. So see, wet mix is already here. I'm going to clear drawing pad. So I'm probably going to have to show you some of this on the canvas because the drawing pad's always not very great at this. Dilution is how much water is in your paint or on your paintbrush before you start, so that it gets diluted a little bit. So even if you had like a more opaque rendering, if you added more water here, you would still get a little more transparent effect. So, and the more you increase it, the more transparent it gets. So, and then decreasing it would be like no water added to the paint at all, just regular paint on your brush. Like you wouldn't water your brush down at all, it's just paint. Or your sponge, in this case, it's a sponge. But, so that is what that is. Charge is how much paint you start off with on your brush. So if you increase this, you're going to see that the beginning of your stroke is much more opaque or bolder or whatever you want to call it. Actually, if you decrease it, you're gonna see it fall off in that way, where the paint is like you only have a finite amount of paint on your brush in the beginning, and if you keep going, it's just gonna keep until it kind of disappears because you've used all the paint on your brush. Whereas if you have it up larger and all the way to the top, it's never gonna run out of paint. You can just keep going with the same stroke, just keep painting. So obviously, if you're doing more of a paintbrush and you want it to be more realistic, you would bring that down a little bit because you wouldn't have an unlimited amount of paint on your brush. You would just have it, so you'd have to keep doing different strokes, just like you would with a regular paintbrush. So that's what that is all about. Let's just put that up a little bit for now. Attack is how bold and thick the paint shows up on the canvas, especially in the places where you push a little harder. So in the middle here, I kind of pushed harder, these two spots, put a little more pressure on my brush. So it has to do with your pressure as well, but it's darkening everything. Like it has more attack everywhere, but it really affects like the more you do, like the thicker it is. So that's what that is. Pull is something I'm going to have to probably show you on the other canvas. Just to explain what it is real quickly. Pull is like you're pulling the paint around on your canvas, and not only the paint you're using, the stroke you're doing now, it'll also pull the paint you have underneath it. So it's going to kind of pull it all together and blend it together. And if you don't have that on, it's just going to put it over it. Like the other one is dry underneath, and you can't do that anymore, basically. So I'm going to put it all the way down first, and I'm going to go done. I'm going to pick a few different colors here. So that is my first stroke. Then I pick this darker one here. Now I don't have any pull on this, so I'm going to do this over here. And you can see that it's just going over that stroke. It's not really pulling anything together. But if I go back and go to pull and bring it up to closer to max or max, let's see what max looks like. You can see it's blending in with that underneath, and it's pulling it all together and like pulling it around the canvas, blending it, so that it's all kind of wet still, and you're able to kind of mix it together is the more pull you have. Otherwise, if you have it all the way down like this, it's like the paint that you already painted on the canvas is already dry, and you're just, and every stroke you take, it's not going to mix it together. So that's what that is. I'm going to bring this, let me just reset the brush where it was. All right, so then grade has to do with the texture in your brush. So if you increase it this way, it's going to kind of smooth it out more. See, it says smooth at the end there. So it's smoothing out the texture. But if you bring it down this way, well, you can't even see it basically. Maybe with a different color, darker one. It has to do with the dilution. Yeah, that's better. Dilution's a little too much there because I can't really see anything. Maybe I have to use a different brush. But what this is supposed to do is this smooths out that texture in your brush, and this would kind of make it a little more like texturized, contrasty, like a little more sharp, like the texture inside. Yeah, I'm not sure how to make that show up on this brush. I picked a bad brush to use. All right, anyway, that is what those are supposed to do. I think you kind of get the idea, but I don't really tend to change that anyway because I can change the texture different ways. Like I can use a different texture if I wanted. So that I don't really do. All right. So increasing the blur is also kind of smoothing out that texture a little bit. It's blurring it, basically. But blur jitter is going to, obviously, this is the same as, like, if you bring it up like this, okay, it can blur up to 80%, and this is how much jitter it's going to be within the stroke, like within those shapes within the stroke. Just like any other time we've seen jitter. So that is what that is. And then wetness jitter is going to do with how much water is applied to, and this has to do with your dilution at any given moment in your stroke. So it kind of is more randomized and it's more realistic, as if you are already painting. Like, you know, sometimes there'll be more water in your stroke than others, so it kind of randomizes the amount of water that goes on in your stroke. But that's what that does. All right, so now we're gonna do color dynamics. So I'm gonna go to a brush that I know that has some already built in. Going to calligraphy, and it's Odeon. Before I go there, I'm going to show you what I mean. So you can see that there's a little bit of a color change going on here as I do the stroke. So that's something that's built into this color dynamics thing. And actually the thing that's changed here is a secondary color under color pressure. So this has to do with how much pressure you're putting on your pencil when you're drawing, and it's taking the secondary color. So what I want to show you is, if you go to color, the color drop here brings up the color menu. And I explained some of this in the color, Procreate for Beginners color video, but I'm gonna go over a little bit of it again. So this here matches this, which matches this. So this is the color that I picked for my primary color. And it's one I just picked from my palette here. But there's one here, and that's my secondary color. And that's what this is used for. Basically, that secondary color is there because you can change things in this next menu that use that secondary color that you pick. So you can pick the certain color that you want to be your secondary color that way. So some of these settings are going to have to do with your secondary color. Some of them you're going to change in other ways, the color. But that is, I just wanted to show you that. And then a quick review. You know, you're picking, if you're on the disc and the color thing, color menu, you are picking your hue around this circle here. So that is like the basic color that you want, the basic color family, or hue of color, like green, yellow, orange, red, pink, purple, blue, light blue, And then if you move this inside here, you're picking kind of the brightness and the saturation. And that's if you're on the disc. So if you're in classic, basically this is that color along the hue there, the disc. And you can, by this slider or by moving this down, this is brightness. It keeps going off. This is the brightness. So this is, with your, we're going to get to saturation, but your saturation all the way up on this side. This is as bright as that color gets, and then going all the way down dark, and it's going to be completely black. So that is brightness. To the left here, moving it to the left and right, this is your saturation. So this is how much of that color you have in that the color you have chosen up there. So again, you can slide this slider down, or you can move this to the left and it'll take the saturation down, or to the right it'll take it up. And then this top slider here, this is the only way you can change this here. This is going to change your hue. So you're going around that circle again, except there's no circle. There's just this line here, and it's taking you around the circle basically. So that's how you do that. And then we went over harmony in the color video. We don't have to do that in this one. Value is the same. You got hue, saturation, brightness here. And then RGB, because we're using an RGB canvas. And then the hexadecimal is like the exact code for that exact color that you're using. But again, I go over all of this in the color video, Procreate for Beginner's Color. Sometimes that pencil doesn't pick it up. But anyway, this is, again, you're changing the hue here and the saturation and the brightness, but you don't have that square where you can see. So these all are going to deal with hue, saturation, brightness, and your secondary color. So I just wanted to kind of review that real quick. Again, if you need more explanation, go to that color video. I will link that. So anyway, I just wanted to go over that real quickly to explain the differences in the color here. So I think I'm going to keep this brush for now. I might decide to change it, I don't know. But going back into color dynamics, so we have stamp color jitter, stroke color jitter, color pressure, and color tilt as the subcategories. And then we have all these things we can change: hue, saturation, lightness or darkness. So that's brightness, basically. Both of those together. And then secondary color for all of those categories. And color pressure has brightness altogether, and so does color tilt. But we're going to go over all this here. So let's get to that. Okay. So I think I'm going to actually change the brush now. This is just one that already had it built in, so I wanted to show you. I'm going to change it to the brush pen down here. That has some pressure sensitivity, and I mean this one does too, but it's a little more easier to see on this one. So I'm going to pick this one. We're going to go to color dynamics, and we'll start going through these things. All right, so we're going to look at this first category first, stamp color jitter. That it has to do with those shapes that you're stamping with every stroke. So I'm just going to change something real quick on here, and I'm going to explain it in a minute. But I'm going to change the hue. Actually, let me clear this out. Pick one of these colors here. And I'm going to change the hue a little bit, and you're going to see what it's kind of doing. Now I'm going to explain this in a minute. But like I kind of said, it's taking one of those stamps that you're making along the stroke path, and it's changing the color of each one. And the more you increase it, the more difference it's going to have in color between the shapes. So I'm going to go back to stroke path, and again, this is a part 1 thing that we talked about, but you can space these stamps out so that they show with space in between each of those stamps along that stroke. So it's going to make it a little easier to kind of see these things. So I'm going to space it out, go back to color dynamics. And again, this has the pressure sensitivity on this brush, and we're going to talk about that in the next video more, but it makes these kind of get a little larger as you go along because you're putting more pressure on here. At least I did put more pressure along there. So, but you're seeing each of these colors now, it has a different color, different hue as you're going along, each of the shapes along the stroke. And then the more you decrease it, the more similar those colors are. They're not as dramatic of a change, like they're all in the same kind of area, family. And basically what this percentage is the color that you're starting with. So we started with this purple one here on the drawing pad. Whatever color, wherever that is on the color wheel, it's taking a percentage around the wheel. So 25% would be like a quarter of the way around the wheel. And it would go within that quarter percentage-wise, and the quarter this way too. And then 50 would take you 50% around. And then 100 would give you the entire color wheel, basically. So that's what that percentage is. And again, it's also the percentage along the hue slider in the ones that don't have the wheel, the way that you choose a color. So that's what that has to do with. So this is, again, because we're under the stamp color jitter, this is each shape in that stroke is changing color. And then saturation is changing the saturation of those. So it's, if you have hue down to 0, you're using that same color, but you're changing the saturation of that color. So sometimes it's white because it doesn't have any saturation. And then, you know, sometimes it's a little somewhere in between white and fully saturated. So you get like a lighter version, not really lighter, but less saturated. Sometimes looks the same as lighter. But anyway, that is what that is changing with each shape. And then the lightness. So lightness is going to change the amount of brightness, like lightness up from 50% up, if that makes sense. Because again, you're kind of taking brightness halfway, lightness, and then darkness is going to take it more dark. So you're going from like a mid-range of that saturation, again, saturation and hue of that color. When you're not changing, because you can change multiple things in here. I'm changing one at a time right now. All the way up to the brightest version of that color, which is 100% saturated, that hue exactly, 100% saturated, and then 100% bright. Versus, like this would be like 50% bright, because it's taking half, because the brightness is cut in half with lightness and darkness. Does that make sense? So darkness is going to take it that lower half and towards like black, because you're taking 0% of the light. And if you wanted to get white in there, what you would have to do is change the saturation. It would take you, all the way to that white, and then how bright you want it to be. Some of these are both 0% saturated, which gets you to the grayish color, the gray value, and then the lightness will take you to white. Basically. So again, if you're having trouble grasping that, go to the color video. I explained that a little more there. But that's what those do. Now, secondary color on the drawing pad always uses black as the default secondary color, but if I were to go in the canvas, I could do it as whatever secondary color I do. So I'm gonna actually do that real quick. I'm gonna go to done. I'm gonna undo this out and I'm gonna go to the color wheel. Pick a color that's kind of similar to the one we were using. I mean, it's not exactly the same, obviously. And then have that secondary color be like this, let's say this green. Well, all right, now we have green as the primary, but that's fine. So what we had it as was secondary color is max, so it's taking strokes all the way up to, if you have it on max, it's taking strokes all the way up to your secondary color. So anything that's in between those colors, whether that's hue-wise, saturation-wise, or lightness-brightness-wise, it's kind of taking that. So it's taking your primary color here, and then your secondary color, and anything kind of in the middle of that in your stroke. But if we put it down to like 50, you kind of see the difference here. Like it's not quite going all the way to that purple. It's just taking all the way to like the middle of that stroke. Rather than the more purpley hues, it's taking the green as it's going towards that purple, if that makes sense. And this all depends on which colors you choose. And then, you know, taking it a little further down, it's just gonna kind of change. No, it's close enough. A little bit closer to that green that you originally picked, but it's kind of veering a little bit towards that purple on the color wheel, but only a little bit. So that's how much that changes. And again, this all has to do with which colors you choose. This is your primary, this is your secondary. So I can kind of show you a different one if you want really quickly. Green and yellow are kind of close though. Let's do red. All right, so again, this is 25% it was at. We picked that red, and then it has the green as a secondary. And then moving up to like 50. You're gonna end up getting ones that are kind of in the middle of red and green. And then moving it all the way up, you're gonna get all the way up to that green at some points. It's a very Christmas type thing. There you go. So again, that has to do with the secondary color you pick. So you can change that. Even if the brush is the same amount percentage, you can change the color to get different varieties of color. But that's what that does. So again, you can change several of these at the same time. Let me clear this. Pick a different color again. So you can change the hue all the way up, or you can change it like 50%. And that'll get you halfway from that color, whatever color you choose. And then, but you can also change the saturation, you know, of each shape randomly. Because again, this is a jitter thing, so it's like every other one's random. And you change the lightness and the darkness, you know, you can change all of these together to get different effects, different color randomizations, basically. So that is stamp jitter. So then you can kind of do the same thing with the stroke jitter. So that's what we're gonna do next here. Stroke color jitter, you're not changing every stamp in that stroke, like every shape along the way, you're changing every stroke. So every stroke you take with your pencil or your finger, if you're using it, you're gonna change all those changes are gonna happen now every stroke you take rather than every shape within the stroke. So if, like you start out with this color, you can see that nothing's really changing yet. But if I were to change the hue here, it's changing the color of every stroke you take, and you have it all the way up. It's gonna go all the way through that color wheel and just kind of randomize the color every time you take a stroke. And then, you know, further down, it's closer in family to that color. And then saturation, again, it changes saturation every stroke. And then lightness, you know, the upper half of the brightness basically, and then darkness, lower half of the darkness, or lower half of the brightness is the darkness. And then secondary color again. And we're in the drawing pad now, so it's taking black as the default because they don't have a secondary color built into the drawing pad when you're kind of playing around with it. So you'd have to go out to canvas and play around with it if you wanted to. But anyway, that is what that, so it's all very similar. The only difference is every stroke is how it's changing. Every stroke you take with, again, the pencil or your finger on the canvas, that is what changes every time. That is what jitters there. So then the next ones we're gonna look at is color pressure and color tilt. All right, so with these two are gonna have to do, again, if you're using the Apple Pencil or possibly another pressure sensitive stylus that works with Procreate. Again, I have no idea how those work. This is the only one I work with, is the Apple Pencil. In theory, those work with this as well, but I always recommend Apple Pencil. It's made for Procreate. Procreate is made for use with the Apple Pencil. So, as I've said in other videos, if you want to get that pressure sensitivity and other, like the tilt we're going to talk about, you have to use an Apple Pencil or possibly another stylus that is similar and has the similar things and works with Procreate. Again, I think those exist. Technically, never used any myself, and I know that Procreate was made for Apple Pencil, so this is the best choice. But it's up to you whether you want to get it or not. But these things are only going to change if you use Apple Pencil or one of those other ones. So I'm going to clear the drawing pad. So this has to do again with, it's going to have a similar kind of thing, except you're doing pressure. So I'm doing very light pressure here, and do dark pressure, hard pressure here, heavy, whatever you want to call it. And then I'm going to kind of vary it here. This is a little chunky, but you get the idea. And of course, drawing pad, typical. Anyway, but you're going to change all those things again. The only difference now, brightness has lightness and darkness in it. So this is like the lightness version and this is the darkness version. And we're going to go over the kind of differences up here with hue and saturation as well. So just changing the hue. You see that it changes all the way to the opposite of the color wheel. So that would be 50%. So it's 50% one way around the color wheel. So you're going to get the differences in color a little bit towards, you know, the end here. Let me get something that's a little more obvious than the purple, actually, to show you. Blue is kind of the opposite of blue is orange on the color wheel. So you can see that when I was doing lighter pressure here, it's that orange that's opposite the blue, and this is the heavy pressure. So you're getting right now the differences between, on one half of the color wheel between blue and orange, you're gonna get those like that bright green and bright yellow and a little bit of that purple there. But if you go the opposite way, you're still gonna go from blue to orange here, but you're gonna get different in between colors because you're going the other way on the color wheel. if that makes sense. I can kind of show you that again on the color wheel if you want. In fact, I can do it right now. So we were starting with like this blue here-ish, and opposite 50% is this orange. So in that first version, we were going along this way, and you're kind of getting in the middle all of these colors. But then the second time we did it, we were going this way, and we're getting more of the reds and purples and dark blues in the middle. So that's what the difference is there. Going back in here now. Of course, this didn't stay. Okay. Going back to blue again. Light, heavy, light, heavy, light, heavy, light, heavy. Oh, it stayed this time. That's nice. All right. So saturation is going to change the saturation of the color. Now, you can't really see much of a difference here on these colors because the colors that they have available on the drawing pad are all like pretty saturated, so you're not going to see much of a difference this way. But bringing it back down this way, at least with this color, I mean, if you were to use a canvas and pick a different color that's not as saturated, you would see a difference. But if you bring this down, it's going to take you further down that saturation down to white, left on those sliders, and also left on that square, and take you closer to white. And because you're starting here at 50% and it's already 100% saturated, this isn't going to do anything. But if you were to pick like let's say half saturated color to begin with, that would take you all the way up to full saturation. So that's the difference there. So then brightness, again, this will take you down to the dark black, and these colors are all pretty close to 100% brightness anyway. So again, same thing with saturation. They don't give you good options in the drawing pad. So I'd have to go out to the canvas and show you, like I said. And then you got secondary color. So because we're in the drawing pad, that picks black as your secondary color. So you see that in heavier pressure, it gives you your secondary color rather than the one you picked. Or it gives you closer to that the further up you go. So that is what that is, and that has to do with the pressure that you're using on your pencil again. So the next thing is color tilt, which is very similar, except this time it's going to be how you're tilting your pencil. So, all right, so tilt. First one I'm going to do straight up and down, and then this one I'm going to tilt it a little different, do it this way. And then let's see if we can get a mid-range with tilt. All right, so hue, it's going to change the hue based on how you're tilting your pencil. And again, this goes same way with the pressure. It goes halfway around, so you got that orangish. And then the ones in the middle, because we didn't really change the tilt as we're going, because it's kind of difficult to do. But you would get like mid-range in between there. And then again, going back down to that orange, but the other half of the color wheel in between here. And then the same with saturation. Again, you can't see much of a difference this way because that color is 100% saturated already. But then this will bring you down further and further to white. And then brightness. Again, that's color is almost 100%. You can see a little bit of a difference. And then all the way down to blackish. Can't get like completely black because it's hard to get that angle exactly. But it's closer to black. And then your secondary color is going to give you closer to black as well, because black is the default again on drawing pad. So that is how you change the color within your brush. Again, these last two things have to do with using Apple Pencil or another stylus that has similar pressure sensitivity that works with Procreate. But these you can use with any tool that you're using, whether it's your finger or a stylus that doesn't have pressure sensitivity, or your Apple Pencil. Doesn't matter. Those you can do no matter what. So that is color dynamics. And you're going to see a little bit more of that when we get to dynamics and Apple Pencil. We talk about more about kind of pressure things that you can do. That's going to be in the next video. And we'll talk about, the rest of these things then. So see you in the next video. All right, as I said, this was part 2 of part 3, so we have part 3 coming up in the brush studio, and we're going to go over the rest of those categories in that video. Then, as I said, we're going to make a few brushes on our own. Now, I don't know if those are going to be, some of them I think will be like a single brush to show you how to make that, because you have to change a bunch of things. But some of them might be a little quicker, so I might put a few different ones in each video. We'll see when I get there. But got a couple of those videos coming regardless. And then after that, we're going to start showing how to do the animation assist feature. And we're going to do a couple simple animations together, same way that we're making brushes. And then after that, I do have my miscellaneous category that I've been talking about throughout this whole thing. That's kind of some of that back end stuff. Some of that I went through in the intro video, that very first video I posted about intro to Procreate. But I'm going to go a little bit more in depth in that one, obviously, and that's going to be a lot of importing, exporting, using like a reference as you're drawing, things like that. Like all that miscellaneous stuff that didn't really fit in with anything else. So we're going to talk about that. And then after we get through all of that, the only thing I said it before that I'm not really talking about is the 3D kind of model. I might go over it briefly in the miscellaneous category, but I don't really use that myself, and I don't feel comfortable talking about it. So I'm not going to, other than the stuff that I do understand about it, I'm not going to confuse you more. So like I said, I might go over a little bit of it in miscellaneous, but that's it. But after all that's done, we will have gone through basically everything on Procreate except for the 3D. And then I'm going to start doing projects where showing you all of these things together. Not all of them on the same video, but like sometimes you'll be using, layer masks and changing your brush and, other things all together rather than separately like I have been in these videos. So those will be a little more, again, practical and hopefully reinforce the things I've been teaching you all along. And you can always go back and reference these videos to get a deeper understanding of those things. I will always reference these videos from those project videos. So that's what you have to look forward to. So I will see you in the next video, which is part 3.